Okay. Look, I realize that through the title, the thumbnail, and the subject, I am already starting at a deficit with some of you. No doubt, the mere appearance of this video in your recommended or subfeed has elicited some kind of strong emotion. I won't tell you to not write that angry reply, I'm not your parent. However, I'd like to propose a deal. Watch this video with an open mind, and then tell me I'm a woke loser or whatever if you still want to. Deal? Oh, also, spoilers for the My Hero manga. Media and culture are intrinsically bound. This is not exactly mind-blowing information. People like McLuhan have explained and pondered this connection way before me, but it remains nonetheless a fascinating connection. Media, by its very nature, reflects mannerisms, behaviors, and opinions that the producing culture holds. Think of how certain classic movies from the 50s are almost unintelligible to us now because they rely on a cultural framework that now only exists in history books. However, at the same time, media products also shape culture, as the values and ideas they present become inevitably absorbed by the audiences and viewers. Even more so now, when more media than ever is being produced and consumed. This duplicitous cycle means that media is, in a way, just culture having a conversation with itself, nudging its values and behaviors in one direction or the other. This is really interesting because it means that you can extract a discussion on most relevant cultural topics out of most media products. They are all forged by and forger of said cultural topics, after all. Thus, a media product cannot get around engaging in this cultural discourse, either by directly addressing it, showing subtler unintentional signs of it, or even by outright omitting the topic. It is impossible for a media product to not communicate about culture, because both what it does say and what it doesn't say end up sending a message. This long-winded theory session was just a way for me to tell you that in critical analysis, you get to apply any topic to almost any media product because of this cycle. For example, I want to read My Hero Academia in the context of masculinity today, and you can't stop me. Now, you might think initially that trying to find a topic like that in a kid's cartoon is maybe a bit heavy-handed, but Hiroaka as a shonen sure has a lot of those ideas. In fact, shonen manga is a great place to look for cultural ideas of masculinity, as they are predominantly written by men, and many of its most popular properties resonate and influence young boys especially, and My Hero is no exception. So, what does Hiroaka have to say about masculinity? Well, this is where I present to you my very own thesis statement. My Hero Academia uses its central trio to expose traditional masculinity as ultimately detrimental, and suggests solutions through modern ideas of masculinity. Look, I know, very collegey, I just went through my exams, shut up, but we'll get through it together. Let's start by defining our key terms. Traditional masculinity simply describes the sum total of all values, behaviors, and norms associated with the traditional patriarchal image of the real man. Think macho men who work hard, don't help around the house, never cry, and only rarely hug their kids. This has also been described as toxic masculinity in modern discourses, as it harms literally everyone, something that I believe Hiraka exposes and shows. Modern ideas of masculinity are, in contrast, more focused on deconstructing those traditional and toxic values. As we in the 21st century begin collapsing the notion of gender roles, modern masculinity is a collection of movements that attempt to establish a new kind of man, a man who is in touch with his emotions, who doesn't have to prove himself by the standards of a bygone era, and who is involved in traditionally feminine activities such as childcare and housework. So, in the most banal terms, this statement can be broken down as the main trio of MHA shows that traditional maleness is outdated and harmful, while presenting modern masculinity as healthy and more productive. But wait, what main trio? Well, here's where we finally get into the anime stuff, as we talk about three characters whose story, in my opinion, negotiates this shift from traditional to modern masculinity. First off, we have King Explosion Murder himself, Katsuki Bakugo. His journey from manic bully to spicy ally is maybe not immediately suggestive of today's topic, but you can certainly read some interesting stuff into it. For starters, what is this dude's problem? I'm not joking. What is the thing that causes him to lash out and be aggressive? The story and the context tell us that he developed a complex tied to his social standing and his quirk. Praised exclusively and constantly for his great power, he comes to believe that it defines him and that, by extension, everyone's worth is defined by their ability and quirk. This absolutely can be tied into traditional toxic views of masculinity. The traditional man is a working man, a man who excels through his productivity, his skill, and his superiority. In short, traditional masculinity often carries with it meritocratic elements, and this is definitely reflected here in Bakugo. Because just like with Bakugo, meritocratic views of masculinity can lead to a worldview where people's worth is defined by their skill and productivity, as opposed to them having, inherent value as people. And this can and will turn toxic, as this means that people who do not have the means, the opportunity, or even just a wish to be traditionally productive are seen as inferior and worth less, potentially leading to harassment and belittlement. That is what happens here with Bakugo, who categorizes people based on their quirks, leading him to relentlessly bully Deku, even suggesting his quirkless life is so devoid of value that he'd better kill himself and hope to be reborn with a quirk. Bakugo spends his boyhood defining himself purely by what his talent and his natural aptitude for achieving his goals can bring him. However, the series exposes this as harmful not just to his environment, but to Bakugo himself. Once faced with UA and the realization that he will inevitably encounter situations he cannot win, and that some people will surpass him in various disciplines, his worldview cannot cope. By his internalized logic, he himself would now be worthless. This continues to boil as he gets beaten by Deku, almost fails the exam and isn't accepted for a provisional license, all as a consequence of the brash, hot-headed nature that was once his defining value. When he then causes the downfall of his idol, he simply cannot keep it in anymore. All the self-doubt and self-loathing that had resulted from his twisted worldview can simply not be negotiated with reality anymore, and it begins to deteriorate his mental state. But, just as things seem dire, the solution presents itself. Instead of clinging to this uber-meritocratic idea of value, his bout with Deku and the subsequent camaraderie that blossoms opens his eyes to the fact that his ambitions and his journey have value in of themselves, rather than only being defined by the immediate results. He frees himself from the toxic mindset that had been pounded into him by his environment and accepts that he doesn't need to be the best right now. As long as he gives it his all and moves forward consistently, he will always be worth something. So, Bakugo presents a narrative wherein he only finds misery and stagnation while he holds on to traditional meritocratic masculine values instilled into him during his formative years, only experiencing relief, positive self-worth, and personal growth once he lets go of those values and embraces more progressive ideas of male self-worth. While Bakugo represents the damages of meritocratic masculinity, our second character, Shoto Todoroki, paints the image of generational masculinity and its pitfalls. But before we can talk about Shoto, let's talk about Endeavor. Anji Todoroki is traditional masculinity personified. A strong, imposing man, the size of a refrigerator, Endeavor is a self-made millionaire who has risen to the top of his environment by the power of his sheer drive and hard work. He is professional but to the point, not wasting any time on niceties or any other social interaction that doesn't further his ambition. A true alpha male. He is a patriarchal figure who controls his family and directs their life in accordance to his will. He is, in short, the natural endpoint of traditional maleness. But, more importantly, his life is a disaster. His ambition leaves him empty and unfulfilled, seeking to compensate the void in his heart with reckless attempts at greatness, attempts which rip apart his family and cause the death of one son and the mental decay of his wife. It is this long, self-destructive adherence to the toxic values of traditional masculinity that end up ruining his life, to the point where all of his achievements, both in the private sphere of personal growth and in the public sphere of societal power, are made void, leaving only a broken man behind. In fact, you could make a sound argument that Endeavor himself presents a damning look at the detrimental effects of unchecked, toxic masculinity. Today, however, I want to focus on how Endeavor's journey affects Shoto and his identity. Fatherhood plays a major role in traditional masculinity, after all. So when Shoto grows up under the patriarchal tyranny of his father, he vows to defy him at all costs, denying him everything he sought to achieve vicariously through his son. But in doing so, Shoto becomes a person very similar to Endeavor. A cold, hyper-focused man who only sees the world as a set of tools to aid him in his goal, some more useful, some less. He, ironically, commits to the same brand of masculinity as his hated father, a self-destructive drive that leads him to ignore everything else, and, maybe more importantly, cause him to ignore and abandon the positive emotions and ideas of self-worth his mother tried to instill into him before the incident. This self-destructive drive is visible through various factors. For example, how Inasa sees Shoto as the same as Endeavor, which leads to both of them failing the license exam. But most crucially, Shoto desires to defy his father so much that he ends up holding himself back from achieving the things he wants himself. In an ironic twist, Shoto's desperate desire to be free of Endeavor's plans ends up defining him, pushing away other aspects of his identity and making him an inverted extension of the ambitious to a fault Enji Todoroki. It is only in Deku's intervention that he finally realizes how damaging this all is to him. Here he stands, in the arena of champions, where heroes prove their mettle at their absolute best, and all he can focus on is how to hurt Daddy. Just how Endeavor allowed his wish to be the best, to swallow everything about him, Shoto was at the verge of letting his desire to defy his dad be the only thing he has, the only part of himself he allows to flourish. But, thanks to the encouraging words of a soon-to-be friend, Shoto awakens to the fact that there is more to his life than just being the boy who hates his father, that his identity doesn't have to be defined by the toxic masculine ambition his father ruined his family with. He wants to help people, simple as that. From this moment onwards, Shoto consistently stops to think about how he feels about his goals and about his powers, promoting a brand of new maleness that is much more in touch with his emotionality. Before, he wouldn't really be concerned with his deeper emotions. He hated Endeavor and that's that. But by even allowing himself to have the conversation of "what do I feel?" in the first place, he already separates himself from the blindfold masculinity of his father and moves into a more progressive, emotionally healthier direction, one that allows him to have a social support network and to follow his dreams without being held back by the man that killed his brother and traumatized his mother. Speaking of emotional masculinity, our final character to discuss is, to no one's surprise, Deku. Out of the main trio, he is the only one who never ends up displaying traits of traditional toxic masculinity, which is also why in both of the previous cases, it is him who helps the other two move past the ties of old-fashioned maleness that limit them. But now that we are at the main boy himself, let's ask ourselves how he does that. Well, if looked at in the context of identity and personal expression, is there anything about Deku that stands out? No, seriously. While Deku's waterworks are a bit of a meme, and I have myself made a video on it, there genuinely is something here that we can extract. Now, Deku is obviously not the first shonen MC to be freely emotionally expressive. We have come a long way since Kenshiro and Jotaro, with many classic shonen heroes like Naruto, Luffy, and even Goku being pretty upfront with how they feel, and yes, with even crying. The audacity! Hell, Naruto is even allowed to hyperventilate on screen due to stress, a very strong emotional reaction that expresses a more emotional masculinity than some older series, and that's really cool. And just to be clear before we get started, when I compare two series and how they depict masculinity, I'm not saying that whichever has a more traditional take is, quote, a worse series, or, quote, intentionally toxic. Every media product is the result of the exact time and culture it originates from, and while it absolutely is valuable to look at how the values presented compare to more modern conceptions of those ideas, I don't want this to come across as me trying to make a comprehensive tier list or whatever. Anyway, shonen heroes have shown a gradient of emotional expression that is far from purely traditionally masculine, but if there's one criticism I can pose at them, it's that in a lot of these cases, it feels like the characters still need an excuse to be emotional. Goku and Naruto may be allowed to be emotional, but only when the literal fate of the world is at stake, or when death stares them in the face, or when life is at its most dire. Even Naruto's stress reaction happens in response to his best friend being deemed a terrorist after instigating World War IV, which could end life as we know it. In short, men are allowed to be emotional, but only in the most extreme circumstances. This trend goes far beyond just anime and manga too. The famous single tear or a quiet sob at the death of a loved one or the failure of a mission is something that you've countless times seen in Hollywood for sure. This begs the question of why these cataclysms are so consistently invoked in conjunction with male emotionality. The straightforward answer is that they are a disclaimer, an excuse. Having the world fall apart around them gives these men the opportunity to be emotional and somewhat progressive without having the audience lose respect for them. You can't call him a wuss, come on, it's the freaking apocalypse! But this, in turn, carries the problematic implication that any man who gets emotional in any situation that's less than Ragnarok are inferior, unmanly, and deserve to lose respect in the eyes of the audience and the public. And this is the central notion of masculinity that is, perhaps unknowingly, created in these slightly older series. To a man, emotional expression isn't a natural, normal thing, but rather a sign of extreme emergency. Enter new generations of shonen manga, and with it, Deku, who is absolutely not afraid of getting a little wet. And while you may or may not find him annoying, it is undeniable that he is much more frequent and more consistent in his emotional expression. But almost more importantly, the world around him does not need to fall apart for him to feel emotional. He doesn't cry because his village was destroyed or his family slaughtered or his planet blown up. He cries because he's anxious, because he's worried, intimidated, a kid in over his head. And whether you like it or not, the message here is quite clear. It's okay to be an emotional man. The world is scary, and sometimes things that nobody but you care about will upset you, and it's okay to get emotional about that. Deku's wimpiness is sometimes played for laughs, but he is generally characterized as courageous, capable, and smart, a true hero. His emotionality doesn't detract from it, it actually enhances his ability to empathize with the world around him, making him a better hero. In short, his emotions being on display is communicated as not something being worth ridicule, but as just a normal human reaction to everyday stress. More importantly maybe, beyond just expression, Deku constantly questions and inquires about his feelings, pondering how and why he feels a certain way about the people and events in his life. He opens up the conversation about his feelings way more than other protagonists have in the past. And through this, Deku ends up being the vehicle for a very progressive message about masculinity. Being a man isn't about being unemotional, and allowing yourself to engage with your own feelings does not make you less of a man. Emotions are a normal part of being human, and denying that to yourself because of your gender and because of dead men's traditions will never be healthy in the long run. Thus, by looking at these three characters, we can construct a foundation that supports the thesis statement I postulated before. Time and time again, traditional male values are shown to ultimately be detrimental, either by directly hindering a character's growth or by deconstructing their self-worth by denying them their humanity. Deku ends up being a beacon of salvation to both of the other characters, as his empathy and progressive masculinity lifts the other two up and empowers them on their journey free of obsolete masculine values. In turn, the story presents traditional masculinity as very much a thing of the past, a flawed worldview that must be let go in favor of a generation of boys that is truly in touch with how they feel and what they want. And when considering that this series is mostly read by young adolescent boys, I think that is a super cool message to send. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a special thank you to all of my patrons, including Archagent Everlasting, Daniel Garcia, Fiction Ape, Ignis, Paracha, Sini, Victor Perez, Cesar Londono, Trader, and Mr. Meander. Thank you all, be safe, wash your hands, and see you around. Bye-bye.